The moon never chooses by birth, it chooses by truth. The words had been carved into the oldest stone beneath the royal palace centuries ago, yet no one living still believed them. On the night of the blood moon ceremony, they believed only in bloodlines, noble houses, and ancient power. Thousands gathered beneath the crimson sky as silver banners drifted in the cool autumn wind across the imperial plaza. Every alpha lord, every respected Luna, and every ambitious noble family waited with quiet confidence, convinced history would repeat itself once again. The blood moon rose slowly above the Blackstone citadel, enormous and glowing like a living heart against the darkness. Its crimson light painted the marble courtyard in shades of scarlet and gold, while the great bronze bells echoed across the empire, announcing the beginning of the ceremony that happened only once every 100 years. King Lucian Blackwood stood upon the moon throne without speaking. His silver eyes swept across the sea of hopeful faces below, unreadable as polished steel. At 32, he had ruled the Werewolf Empire through wisdom rather than fear, earning loyalty from packs stretching farther than any rider could cross in a week. Tonight, however, even he was merely a witness. Not even a king commanded the blood moon. The ancient priestesses entered in perfect silence, their white robes flowing across the stone floor as they carried crystal lanterns that shimmered with pale blue fire. One by one, the daughters of the empire's greatest houses stepped forward. Each had spent years preparing for this single moment. Elegant gowns sparkled beneath the moonlight. Priceless jewels reflected crimson rays. Proud families watched with hopeful smiles as each noblewoman approached the sacred circle at the center of the plaza. Nothing happened. The moon remained silent. Another stepped forward, then another. The silence deepened until whispers spread through the enormous crowd like leaves carried by the wind. High above them, hidden behind carved columns overlooking the ceremony, a young servant quietly polished a silver ceremonial tray. Evelyn Carter kept her eyes lowered, careful not to distract anyone important. She had learned years ago that invisible people survived the longest. An orphan raised within the temple walls, she spent her days carrying books, lighting candles, and cleaning halls that others considered too sacred for ordinary workers. Few people even knew her name. Fewer still noticed her gentle smile whenever she helped frightened children or exhausted attendants find a moment of comfort before great ceremonies. Tonight she expected nothing different. She simply hoped to finish her duties before sunrise. Then the impossible happened. The blood moon pulsed once. A ripple of crimson light swept across the plaza, passing every noblewoman without hesitation. Gasps rose from every corner of the courtyard as the ancient moon seal floating above the sacred circle cracked with a sound like distant thunder. Every lantern flickered. Every bell fell silent. Even the wind seemed to stop breathing. Slowly, deliberately, the crimson light climbed the palace stairs instead of remaining within the ceremony below. It crossed marble balconies, drifted through towering pillars, and stopped before the one person no one had thought worthy of looking at. Evelyn froze as warm light surrounded her trembling hands. The silver tray slipped from her fingers, striking the floor with a clear ringing sound that echoed across the silent empire. For the first time that night, King Lucian lifted his eyes from the sacred circle and looked directly at the forgotten servant the blood moon had chosen. Evelyn could not breathe. The warm crimson light wrapped gently around her like the first rays of sunrise after a long winter, neither burning nor blinding, only waiting. Every pair of eyes in the imperial plaza followed its impossible path until they found the young servant standing alone on the palace balcony. Moments earlier, she had been invisible. Now silence itself seemed to bend around her. Below, whispers spread faster than the evening wind. Some nobles stared in disbelief. Others exchanged nervous glances, convinced they had witnessed an ancient ritual fail before their eyes. A daughter of no noble house could not be chosen. An orphan with no family crest could not stand where queens had once stood. The oldest priestess slowly lifted her trembling hands toward the sky. Her silver hair shimmered beneath the crimson moonlight as she searched the sacred symbols floating above the ceremony. Instead of fading, the glowing moon seal expanded into a circle of brilliant light that reflected across every polished stone in the plaza. She lowered her head with quiet reverence, but before she could speak, voices erupted from the crowd. Several powerful nobles insisted the ceremony had been interrupted. Others demanded the ritual begin again before the moon completed its climb across the night sky. They claimed a servant had accidentally stepped into a sacred current of magic meant for someone worthy. Evelyn heard every word, and each one felt painfully familiar. She had spent 23 years hearing people explain why she could never belong. She remembered sweeping temple floors before sunrise while young noble girls practiced royal etiquette nearby. She remembered carrying heavy baskets through endless corridors as instructors praised daughters born to privilege. She remembered eating alone after everyone else had finished because servants always came last. None of those memories filled her with anger. They had simply become the quiet rhythm of her life. She had learned that kindness required no audience. Every morning, she left fresh bread outside an elderly gardener's door without saying a word. She patiently read stories to children waiting for parents who rarely came home before sunset. When frightened wolf pups wandered into the temple gardens, somehow they always curled beside her feet instead of running away. She never thought those small moments mattered. She certainly never imagined the moon had noticed them. High above the growing chaos, King Lucian remained perfectly still. His advisors leaned toward him, each offering urgent opinions, but he ignored every voice except the one echoing inside his own thoughts. Since childhood, he had memorized every surviving record about the blood moon. None described what he had just witnessed. The moon had never searched beyond the sacred circle. It had never climbed palace walls. It had never chosen someone hidden from the ceremony itself. His gaze never left Evelyn as she instinctively stepped backward, clearly wishing the impossible attention would disappear. She looked neither proud nor ambitious. She looked frightened that she had disrupted something holy. That single expression unsettled him more than any miracle could. Power often revealed hidden ambition, yet the young woman touched by destiny seemed to want nothing except permission to quietly return to her work. Then the crimson light rose once more, forming a delicate crown-shaped halo above Evelyn's head before dissolving into thousands of glowing silver sparks that drifted across the night sky. As the final spark disappeared, the oldest priestess fell to one knee, and with a voice barely louder than a whisper, she spoke words that would change the empire forever. The blood moon has made its choice. The words settled over the imperial plaza with astonishing weight. No thunder answered them. No burst of dazzling light followed. The quiet certainty in the high priestess's voice carried farther than any shout ever could. For one endless moment, no one moved. Then the silence shattered into a storm of disbelief. Noble families rose from their seats, speaking over one another as outrage swept through the marble courtyard. Some demanded that the sacred records be examined again. Others insisted the blood moon had been corrupted by an unknown force. A queen could not come from the temple kitchens. She could not be an orphan without a family crest, without political alliances, without generations of royal blood behind her name. Evelyn remained frozen where she stood, her heartbeat loud enough that she could barely hear the arguments below. She looked down at her simple gray servant's dress, still dusted with fine silver powder from polishing ceremonial trays only minutes earlier. Nothing about her had changed. Her hands were the same hands that scrubbed temple floors before dawn. Her shoes were still worn from years of walking endless palace corridors. Even now, part of her wondered if someone else stood behind her, someone the moon had truly intended to choose. The high priestess slowly climbed the palace staircase with remarkable calm despite her advanced age. Every step echoed across the silent stone until she stopped a few feet from Evelyn. Her gentle eyes searched the young woman's face, not with doubt, but with quiet recognition. Without speaking, she bowed her head. The simple gesture sent another wave of shock through the crowd below. Never in living memory had the guardian of the moon temple bowed before anyone except the reigning monarch. Evelyn instinctively stepped backward, shaking her head. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "There must be some mistake." The elderly woman smiled with unexpected warmth. "The moon has never mistaken a soul," she replied softly. "Only people do." Across the plaza, King Lucian finally descended from the moon throne. His long black ceremonial coat moved gently behind him as he crossed the polished marble without haste. The shouting gradually faded as every eye followed their king. He did not look toward the furious nobles. He did not acknowledge the growing demands for another ceremony. Instead, he stopped several feet from Evelyn, studying her expression with careful attention. He saw no hunger for power, no triumph, no calculation, only confusion, humility, and an almost overwhelming desire to disappear from everyone's attention. Those qualities unsettled him far more than confidence ever could. The oldest royal advisor stepped forward and cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, tradition requires immediate review before any declaration is accepted." Lucian answered without taking his eyes off Evelyn. "Tradition also teaches that no ruler stands above the will of the Blood Moon." The advisor lowered his gaze, unable to respond. Far beyond the palace walls, church bells throughout the capital suddenly began ringing on their own. Their deep voices rolled across the city, drifting through marketplaces, quiet neighborhoods, and distant watchtowers. Citizens stopped what they were doing and looked toward the glowing palace atop the hill. No messenger had reached them. No announcement had been made. Yet somehow everyone felt that history had shifted. Standing beneath the fading crimson sky, Evelyn noticed something no one else seemed to see. A small white wolf pup quietly emerged from the palace garden and walked across the empty marble toward her. It showed no fear of the enormous crowd. Reaching her feet, it calmly sat beside her and lifted its bright silver eyes to meet hers, as though it had been waiting for this moment long before anyone else believed it could ever come. The little white wolf pup settled beside Evelyn as though the palace had always belonged to both of them. Its snow-colored fur shimmered beneath the fading crimson glow, and its bright silver eyes never left her face. Murmurs swept through the nobles once again. Everyone recognized the animal. It was one of the sacred moon wolves, creatures that had not appeared during a royal ceremony for generations. According to ancient tradition, they approached only those blessed by the moon goddess herself. Evelyn slowly lowered herself to one knee, afraid that even the smallest movement might frighten the tiny visitor away. Instead, the pup gently rested its head against her hand with complete trust. A quiet warmth spread through her fingers, not magical or overwhelming, but deeply comforting, like coming home after years of wandering. She smiled without realizing it. The expression was so natural and sincere that even some palace attendants watching from distant balconies found themselves smiling in return. The moment lasted only a heartbeat before another wave of protest echoed across the plaza. Lord Theodore Ashcroft, leader of one of the empire's oldest noble houses, stepped forward with visible determination. His rich blue ceremonial cloak brushed across the marble as he addressed the king. "Your Majesty, the empire cannot be guided by emotion. A sacred sign deserves respect, but a servant cannot suddenly become the future of every pack. We request that the council review every ancient record before accepting this impossible result." Several influential families nodded immediately. Others quietly joined them, less out of certainty than fear. Their entire world had been built upon predictable rules. If the Blood Moon could choose someone like Evelyn, then every certainty they had relied upon could disappear overnight. King Lucian listened without interruption. His expression remained calm, revealing neither agreement nor disappointment. Years of leadership had taught him that fear often spoke louder than reason during moments of great change. He looked once more toward Evelyn. She was not arguing. She was not defending herself. In fact, she appeared ready to step away if doing so would restore peace to everyone around her. That single realization lingered in his mind. Someone chasing power would have demanded recognition. Evelyn seemed willing to surrender it before she had even accepted that it was real. The high priestess turned toward the gathering with quiet dignity. "The Blood Moon has never asked permission from kings, councils, or noble houses," she said. "Its choice is not an election. It is a revelation." Her words settled heavily across the plaza, yet they did little to calm anxious hearts. The uncertainty had already spread beyond the palace walls. Bells continued ringing throughout the capital, and citizens gathered along the streets, looking toward Blackstone's citadel with hopeful curiosity and uneasy anticipation. They did not know what had happened, only that something extraordinary had changed the course of history. As palace guards respectfully formed a protective path through the courtyard, Lucian took one measured step toward Evelyn. He stopped at a respectful distance, careful not to overwhelm her. "Miss Carter," he said in an even voice, Until the council understands what the blood moon has revealed, you will remain under royal protection." Evelyn looked up in surprise. Before she could answer, the tiny white wolf suddenly lifted its head toward the palace tower and gave a soft, clear howl. Far above them, hidden within the ancient stone walls where no one had looked for centuries, a forgotten silver bell answered with a single gentle chime, awakening a legend that the Empire believed had been silent forever. The gentle chime lingered in the air long after the silver bell had fallen silent, and for the first time in decades, even the oldest members of the royal council struggled to hide their astonishment. Several exchanged uneasy glances, recognizing the sound from stories their grandparents had once dismissed as legends. The bell of the first queen had not answered a living soul for more than 500 years. King Lucian noticed the change in their expressions immediately. Whatever secrets the council had buried beneath generations of tradition, they had just been reminded that those secrets were still alive. Without another word, he turned toward Captain Adrian Hayes, commander of the Royal Guard. "Escort Miss Carter to the eastern residence," he instructed calmly. "Only those with my permission may enter." Adrian placed a respectful hand across his chest before stepping toward Evelyn. There was no fear in his eyes, no trace of the uncertainty filling the plaza. "This way, Miss Carter," he said gently. Evelyn hesitated, glancing back at the temple balcony where she had expected to spend the rest of the evening polishing ceremonial silver until dawn. Everything familiar suddenly felt impossibly distant. She looked at the tiny white wolf beside her, expecting it to disappear into the gardens now that the ceremony had ended. Instead, the pup quietly rose and walked beside her as though it had accepted its own assignment. No guard attempted to stop it. As they crossed the palace courtyard, servants paused in silent curiosity. Many recognized Evelyn immediately. She was the young woman who always carried extra blankets during winter mornings. The one who stayed late helping elderly workers finish difficult tasks without expecting praise. More than one servant lowered their head respectfully as she passed, confusing Evelyn even further. She wanted to tell them she was still the same person she had been only an hour earlier, but the words refused to come. Above them, the crimson color slowly faded from the moon, leaving behind soft silver light that bathed the palace in quiet peace. Back in the grand hall, debate continued with growing intensity. Lord Theodore Ashcroft insisted that ancient law required a complete investigation before the Empire accepted such an extraordinary choice. Several nobles agreed, but the High Priestess simply placed an aged leather journal upon the council table. Dust drifted into the lantern light as she carefully opened its weathered pages. Every signature inside belonged to generations of temple guardians. The final page contained only one unfinished sentence, written nearly 6 centuries earlier. "When the forgotten bell sings again, seek not the strongest air, but the unseen heart chosen by the moon." No name followed. No explanation remained. The ink ended there as though history itself had been waiting for the rest to be written. Lucian read the words twice before quietly closing the journal. His instincts, sharpened through years of leadership, told him that this mystery reached far beyond politics or noble bloodlines. Someone had expected this night long before anyone living had been born. Meanwhile, Evelyn stood alone inside the eastern residence overlooking the palace gardens. The room was elegant yet peaceful, filled with warm candlelight and shelves of carefully preserved books instead of glittering displays of wealth. She slowly touched the edge of a nearby window, still trying to understand why destiny had led her here. The little white wolf jumped onto the wide stone windowsill and gazed toward the distant forest beyond the capital. A cool breeze drifted through the open window carrying the scent of pine and fresh rain. Then, somewhere deep within the ancient woods beyond the Empire, another silver bell answered the first, its faint echo reaching Evelyn alone, as though an unseen voice had finally begun calling her home. Sleep refused to come. Evelyn stood beside the open window long after the palace had grown quiet, listening to the distant sound of leaves moving through the gardens below. The faint echo of the second silver bell still lingered in her thoughts, gentle enough that she wondered whether she had imagined it. Yet the little white wolf remained awake beside the window, its ears lifting toward the distant forest as though it had heard the same mysterious call. Before sunrise, a soft knock came at the chamber door. Captain Adrian Hayes entered with respectful formality. "His Majesty requests your presence," he said. "There is something you should see." Evelyn quietly followed him through corridors she had once cleaned every morning before the palace awakened. Everything felt strangely familiar, yet completely different. Servants who had once hurried past her now paused with quiet respect. Some smiled with cautious hope. Others simply watched in thoughtful silence, unsure whether they were witnessing the beginning of a miracle or a mystery. Adrian led her beyond the public halls into a forgotten wing of Blackstone's citadel that few people were permitted to enter. Heavy oak doors opened into an immense circular library filled with towering shelves that disappeared into the shadows above. Ancient books rested beside carefully preserved scrolls, and stained glass windows filled the room with gentle blue and silver light. King Lucian was already waiting beside a large stone table where the high priestess had spread several weathered manuscripts across its surface. None of them spoke immediately. The room itself seemed to command quiet reverence. Finally, the high priestess unfolded a brittle parchment whose edges had darkened with age. At its center was a painting unlike any Evelyn had ever seen. It showed a young woman standing beneath a crimson moon while a white wolf rested faithfully at her side. Above her floated a crown formed entirely of silver light. Evelyn's breath caught. The woman did not look exactly like her, yet there was something unmistakably familiar in the gentle expression, the humble posture, and even the quiet kindness reflected in her eyes. Beneath the painting, elegant handwriting stretched across the faded parchment. The high priestess read the ancient words aloud. "When pride blinds the mighty and power becomes their only language, the moon goddess shall not seek the strongest throne. She shall awaken the unseen heart, whose compassion unites what strength alone cannot." Silence settled over the library once more. Lucian slowly looked toward Evelyn. "Every ruler before me believed this prophecy referred to a forgotten royal bloodline," he said thoughtfully. "But perhaps we misunderstood it from the very beginning." Evelyn lowered her eyes. "I am not extraordinary," she answered honestly. "I have never led anyone. I have never even imagined wearing a crown." The high priestess smiled gently. "That is precisely why these words have survived for centuries. They never promised the empire another powerful ruler. They promised someone who would remember every life beneath the crown." As Evelyn quietly absorbed those words, the little white wolf wandered across the library until it stopped before an enormous carved map hanging upon the far wall. Without warning, a tiny silver mark appeared near the center of the ancient forest beyond the capital. The glowing point pulsed softly, then another answered farther north, followed by a third deep within the mountains. Lucian stepped closer, recognizing symbols that had never appeared on the map before. They formed a path leading far beyond the empire's borders. The high priestess drew a slow breath, her eyes widening with understanding. "The moon is not only revealing its queen," she whispered. "It is asking her to complete a journey that no ruler has finished in generations." The glowing marks upon the ancient map refused to fade. Instead, they pulsed with a quiet rhythm, almost like a heartbeat echoing through the silent library. Evelyn stepped closer without realizing it, her eyes following the silver trail that disappeared beyond the northern mountains and into lands no traveler had entered for centuries. Every story she had ever heard described those forests as forgotten places where the oldest promises of the moon goddess still rested beneath towering pines. King Lucian gently placed his hand upon the edge of the stone table, studying the map with thoughtful caution. "If this path truly belongs to the prophecy, then someone has been waiting a very long time for it to appear." The high priestess slowly nodded. "Not someone," she answered. "Something." Her words lingered in the stillness before she carefully reached beneath the table and removed a small wooden chest sealed with faded silver wax. The seal bore the same crescent symbol that had floated above Evelyn during the ceremony. With careful hands, the priestess opened the lid. Inside rested a simple silver compass unlike any crafted by ordinary artisans. There were no numbers around its edge, no directions carved into the polished metal. Only a single crystal rested beneath the glass, glowing with a soft white light. The priestess placed it into Evelyn's hands. The moment her fingers touched the cool silver, the crystal awakened, and its delicate light turned toward the northern mark on the map. It did not spin or hesitate. It simply knew where it belonged. Evelyn stared in amazement. I have never seen anything like this. Neither has anyone alive. The priestess replied with a gentle smile. It has remained asleep for generations. At that moment, hurried footsteps echoed through the corridor outside the library. Captain Adrian Hayes entered respectfully, though his expression carried unusual concern. Your Majesty, he said, bowing his head. Representatives from every great house have gathered in the Grand Chamber. They are requesting an emergency council. They believe the Empire should appoint another candidate until the prophecy is fully understood. Lucian closed the ancient journal before him with calm certainty. Then they are afraid. Adrian answered honestly. Yes, Your Majesty. They are afraid that everything they believed about power is changing. Evelyn quietly lowered her gaze. She understood fear. She had lived beside it her entire life. Yet this fear belonged to people who had always possessed influence, comfort, and certainty. Now, for the first time, they stood where she had always stood, uncertain of what tomorrow might bring. Instead of satisfaction, she felt compassion. If they are frightened, she said softly, then they deserve answers, not more uncertainty. The room fell silent. Lucian looked at her with quiet admiration. Many rulers would have answered doubt with authority. Evelyn answered it with understanding. Once again, the prophecy seemed less mysterious than before. The high priestess smiled knowingly, but said nothing. The little white wolf suddenly rose from beside the library fireplace and walked to Evelyn's feet. It gently nudged the silver compass with its nose before looking toward the open doorway. Almost immediately, the crystal inside the compass glowed brighter than before, casting shimmering patterns across the library floor. Outside, the morning sun broke above the palace towers. Yet for one extraordinary moment, every ray of sunlight bent toward the silver path on the ancient map, illuminating a forgotten road that no one else in the Empire had remembered until the moon chose the one person humble enough to follow it. The Grand Chamber had never held so many uncertain hearts beneath one roof. Representatives from every great house filled the circular hall, their embroidered cloaks creating a sea of silver, blue, crimson, and emerald beneath the towering glass dome. Sunlight streamed through the ancient windows, illuminating the carved symbols of every pack that had sworn loyalty to the Empire across countless generations. At the center of the chamber stood the moon throne, empty except for the silver crown resting upon its velvet cushion. It had remained untouched since the previous queen passed into history many years before. King Lucian entered first, his calm presence quieting the restless voices without a single command. Captain Adrian Hayes walked a respectful distance behind him, followed by the high priestess carrying the ancient journal. Evelyn came last. She wore no royal gown and no glittering jewels. The palace attendants had offered countless elegant garments that morning, but she had chosen a simple white dress trimmed with modest silver embroidery, believing that borrowed luxury could never define who she truly was. As she stepped into the chamber, many nobles studied her with open curiosity instead of anger. During the long night, stories had already spread throughout the capital. Servants spoke of her kindness. Gardeners remembered how she had cared for injured birds. Palace cooks recalled that she always shared fresh bread with anyone who had gone without a meal. Piece by piece, a different portrait had begun replacing the rumors that she was merely an unknown servant. Lord Theodore Ashcroft slowly rose from his seat. The room became silent, expecting another challenge. Instead, the aging noble looked directly at Evelyn. Miss Carter, he began carefully, I spent my life believing leadership belonged only to those born into it. Last night, I questioned the moon's wisdom because I feared losing everything that felt familiar. This morning, I spoke with people who have known you for years. Every one of them described the same woman. Not someone seeking power, but someone quietly carrying burdens that were never her responsibility. Perhaps that is the strength we forgot to value. A quiet murmur swept through the chamber. One by one, other representatives slowly stood, not in complete agreement, but in thoughtful respect. Fear had begun giving way to reflection. Evelyn felt her eyes fill with emotion. She had never imagined that the smallest acts of kindness, unnoticed for so many years, had remained alive in other people's memories. King Lucian stepped toward the moon throne and gently lifted the ancient silver crown into his hands. Every eye followed him. The crown itself shimmered softly, reflecting both sunlight and the fading glow of the previous night's miracle. He stopped before Evelyn and held the crown for a long moment without speaking. "A ruler is not measured by the weight of a crown," he finally said. "A ruler is measured by the hearts that feel safe enough to hope because that person exists." Then, in full view of every noble house, every council elder, every temple guardian, and every palace servant, Lucian lowered himself onto one knee. The chamber fell into complete silence. No king in recorded history had ever offered such public honor before the official coronation. With steady hands, he placed the silver crown gently upon Evelyn's head. At that very instant, warm silver light flowed through the chamber like morning sunlight after a storm. The ancient banners stirred, although no wind entered the hall. High above them, the crystal dome reflected a single white wolf running across the sky before disappearing into brilliant light. Even those who had doubted until that moment quietly bowed their heads. They were no longer witnessing the rise of an unexpected queen. They were witnessing the beginning of an entirely new chapter for the empire, one written not by privilege or ambition, but by humility, compassion, and the quiet courage to place others before oneself. The silver light slowly faded, but the feeling it left behind remained in every heart gathered inside the grand chamber. No one rushed to speak. No one hurried toward the doors. For the first time in many years, the empire simply stood together in quiet reflection. Evelyn gently touched the silver crown resting upon her head, almost expecting it to disappear like a dream. It felt surprisingly light, as though it had never been meant to burden the person who wore it. She looked across the chamber and recognized familiar faces among the palace staff. The elderly gardener who had once shared stories while planting spring flowers smiled through grateful tears. The young kitchen apprentice she had encouraged after countless difficult mornings stood a little taller than before. Even the attendants who had once overlooked her now looked at her with warmth instead of habit. In that moment, Evelyn understood something she had never considered. A crown did not erase the life she had lived. It carried every lesson she had learned through quiet service, every act of kindness offered without expectation, and every ordinary day that had shaped the woman standing before them now. King Lucian watched the change in the room with quiet satisfaction. The empire had not become united because everyone suddenly agreed. It had become united because hope had finally entered a place where certainty had ruled for too long. The high priestess stepped toward the great windows overlooking the capital. Outside, thousands of citizens had gathered across the palace square. They could not hear what had happened inside, yet somehow they sensed the moment had arrived. As the enormous palace doors slowly opened, sunlight poured across the marble steps. Evelyn walked beside Lucian, not ahead of him and not behind him, but beside him as an equal entrusted with the future of the realm. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine through the city as the little white wolf trotted happily at her side. When the people saw the silver crown upon Evelyn's head, no announcement was necessary. One by one, hats were removed, hands were placed over hearts, and respectful bows spread through the crowd like ripples across a quiet lake. Above the palace, the last traces of crimson vanished from the morning sky. The blood moon had completed its purpose and quietly surrendered the heavens to brilliant blue. At the very same moment, the silver marks upon the ancient map deep within the royal library dissolved into soft light, leaving behind only a single glowing path that stretched beyond the empire toward the distant northern forest. The journey had not ended. It had only begun. Evelyn lifted her eyes toward the horizon, feeling the quiet pull of that unseen road. She no longer feared it. Whatever waited beyond those ancient trees had chosen patience over power, trusting that the right heart would one day answer its call. Lucian noticed the determination growing behind her gentle smile and understood that the greatest chapters of their story still lay ahead. The empire had gained more than a queen. It had gained a reminder that greatness could begin in the smallest acts of compassion, and that destiny often walked unnoticed until the moment the world was finally ready to see it. Far beyond the mountains, where no messenger had traveled in generations, a final silver bell rang once across the silent forest. Its clear note drifted through the morning air before fading into peaceful stillness, as though the moon goddess herself had whispered that the forgotten promise had finally been fulfilled, and a new